May 8, 1972. Haiphong Harbor, North Vietnam. The humidity in the Gulf of Tonkin was thick enough to choke an engine. On the bridge of the Soviet freighter Grisha Akopian, the mood was not one of fear, but of industrious mechanical arrogance. The vessel was one of dozens of Soviet merchant ships anchored in the mouth of the Kuakam River, a heavy steel artery pumping life into the North Vietnamese war machine. Below the decks, the cargo holds were cavernous and packed tight. They were not carrying grain or medical supplies. They were loaded with heavy crates, marked with Cyrillic stencils, parts for surface-to-air missiles, radar components, and heavy-caliber ammunition. For months, this harbor had been the sanctuary. The Americans, for all their air power, had been terrified of accidentally striking a Soviet hull and triggering World War III. This political hesitation had created a shield of invincibility around the docks. The Soviet captains knew it. The North Vietnamese dockworkers knew it. They unloaded T-54 tanks and artillery shells in broad daylight, right under the nose of the American 7th Fleet. But at exactly 0900 hours local time, that immunity evaporated. To the observer on the Soviet bridge, the sound came first, a low, tearing scream of high-bypass turbofans compressing the humid air. It was not the high-altitude rumble of B-52 bombers, which usually signaled a raid on the logistical trails inland. This was visceral. It was low. It was fast. From the cloud deck, American naval aviators descended with a precision that seemed almost robotic. They were flying a 6 Intruder and a 7 Corsair aircraft, launching from the deck of the USS Coral Sea miles out in the Gulf. But as the Soviet crewmen grabbed their binoculars, expecting to see the wings detach with the flash of 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs aimed at the rail yards, they saw something completely inexplicable. The American jets were not diving on the warehouses, they were not targeting the anti-aircraft batteries that ringed the city. They were flying straight and level, dangerously low over the water, right down the center of the shipping channel. From the wings of the intruders, dark shapes fell. They did not streak down with the velocity of a bomb. They drifted. Parachutes deployed, thousands of them, blooming like malicious white flowers against the grey sky. The water of the harbor erupted, not with the concussive geysers of high explosives, but with thousands of heavy, rhythmic splashes. It looked less like an air raid, and more like an industrial accident. The calm, muddy waters of Haiphong churned as cylinder after cylinder punched through the surface and vanished into the silt below. On the docks, the North Vietnamese stevedores paused, shielding their eyes. The Soviet advisors stood on the decks of their supply ships, cigarettes burning down to their fingers, utterly confused. There were no explosions, no secondary fires, no smoke rising from the city. The American jets banked hard, their afterburners glowing amber as they punched back through the cloud layer and vanished as quickly as they had arrived. The entire operation had taken less than 2 minutes. Silence returned to the harbor, save for the lapping of waves against the rusted hulls of the Soviet merchant fleet. The water looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes prior. The channel was open. The sea was calm, but a palpable, cold dread began to wash over the Soviet captains. They were seasoned mariners. They knew that the Americans did not risk multi-million-dollar airframes just to drop garbage into a river. They checked their radios. Static. Then, frantic chatter in Vietnamese began to flood the local frequencies. Something had changed. The physics of the battlefield had shifted in 120 seconds, but nobody on the ground could see it. The water was no longer water. It was a kill zone. Before we unravel the mechanism of this invisible siege, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact to understand the hidden moves that defined the superpower standoff. The confusion in Hanoi was absolute. The North Vietnamese leadership, currently riding a wave of adrenaline from their massive Easter offensive pushing south, suddenly found their primary lifeline strangulated by a ghost. To understand the magnitude of this confusion, we must look at the weeks leading up to this morning. Throughout the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese army had launched a conventional invasion of the South that rivaled the scale of the Second World War battles. This was not a guerrilla war anymore. This was heavy armor, massed artillery, and sophisticated anti-air networks. All of it, every single shell, every gallon of aviation fuel, every spare track link for the tanks, came from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And 85% of those supplies flowed through one singular choke point, Haiphong. The Soviets believed they had won the logistics war. They had flooded the port with so much tonnage that the Americans couldn't bomb it fast enough to stop the flow. The sheer volume was the strategy. But as the sun rose higher on May 8th, the harbour master in Haiphong received a transmission that chilled the blood of every sailor in the port. It wasn't a local report. It was a rebroadcast of a speech being given halfway across the world in Washington, D.C. President Richard Nixon was on television. He wasn't talking about invasion. He wasn't talking about nukes. He was talking about the water outside their hulls. The transmission confirmed what the Soviet captains had begun to suspect with growing horror. The parachutes were not supplies, they were mines. But these were not the crude, contact-fused iron spheres of the 1940s that floated on the surface, visible to a lookout. These were something entirely new. These were bottom-dwelling predators. The claim from Washington was terrifyingly specific. The mines were active. Any vessel trying to leave the port would be destroyed. Any vessel trying to enter would be destroyed. The Americans claimed to have seeded the harbour with a density so high that safe passage was statistically impossible. But here was the mystery that baffled the Soviet naval experts on the ground. The activation time. Nixon had announced that the mines would activate automatically after a set period to allow neutral ships a chance to leave. He gave them a window, a grace period. This created a psychological torture for the Soviet captains. They looked at the muddy water. It looked innocent. They had schedules to keep. The war effort in the south was burning through ammunition at a staggering rate. Moscow was demanding tonnage reports. The captains were now faced with a choice that no sailor ever wants to make. Do you trust the enemy's warning, or do you trust your own eyes? If the Americans were bluffing, staying in port would be a humiliation, a dereliction of duty that could end a career. If the Americans were telling the truth, moving the ship meant death. The harbour authorities sent out small probe boats. Wooden sampans and tugs cautiously navigated the channel. They passed over the spots where the parachutes had fallen. Nothing happened. The water rippled. The boats moved. The mines slept. This deepened the confusion. Had the drop failed? Was it a psychological trick? The Soviet naval attachés began to argue that it was a bluff. They urged the captains to prepare for departure, to break this paper blockade, and show the Americans that the Soviet merchant marine could not be intimidated by a few splashes in the water. But then, the sun began to set. The grace period announced by Washington was ticking down to zero. The atmosphere in the port shifted from industrial bustle to the tense, suffocating quiet of a graveyard. Thousands of tons of war material sat in the holds of the ship's tanks that were needed on the front lines in Unlock and Kontum. But the propellers of the Grisha Akopian remained still. The Soviet diplomatic channels were exploding with activity. In Moscow, the Kremlin was blind. They demanded to know the technical specifications of the ordnance. Were they magnetic? Acoustic? Pressure-sensitive? How could the Americans mine a harbour so quickly without using ships? Usually, mining operations required days of slow, methodical seeding by surface vessels or submarines. To do it from the air, at jet speeds, in a single pass, implied a level of technology that the Soviets had not accounted for. If the Americans could turn a harbour into a no-go zone in minutes, it meant that every Soviet port from Vladivostok to Murmansk was theoretically vulnerable to being shut down instantly. As night fell over Haiphong, the first brave or perhaps foolish test was made. Reports vary on the exact vessel, but small craft began to move through the outer perimeter, testing the waters as the deadline passed. The result was not a fiery explosion, but a strange, terrifying silence. The mines did not detonate on the small boats. This was even more unnerving. A simple contact mine kills anything that touches it. A mine that chooses its target is a thinking weapon. The North Vietnamese divers, brave men who had dismantled unexploded bombs before, looked at the murky, silt-heavy water of the harbour with trepidation. Visibility was near zero. To find a mine in that mud, you had to feel for it. And if these mines were magnetic, the very gear the divers wore could trigger them. If they were acoustic, the sound of a regulator breathing could set them off. The harbour was effectively paralysed, not by steel but by uncertainty. By the next morning, the reality set in. 36 merchant ships were trapped in the harbour. They couldn't move. They couldn't unload fast enough. And out in the Gulf, the US Navy carriers were turning into the wind again. The initial drop had been the lock. Now, the Americans were throwing away the key. But the true shock was not just that the mines were there. It was what they represented. The Soviet advisors realized they were looking at a new generation of warfare, one where the enemy didn't need to destroy the ships to win. They just needed to manipulate the geography. The questions racing through the minds of the Soviet Naval Command were desperate. How long would the batteries in these mines last? Did they have counters to let a few ships pass before blowing up the fifth or sixth one? Could they be swept? Nobody knew. And as long as they didn't know, the mighty Soviet supply chain, the backbone of the communist offensive, was severed. The Americans had achieved with a few dozen sorties what they had failed to achieve with years of bombing. They had shut the door. But the Soviet Union was a superpower. They possessed the largest mine-sweeping fleet in the world. They had scientists, engineers, and tactical experts. They were not going to let a few American gadgets humiliate them on the global stage. As the paralysis of Part 1 sets in, the Soviet reaction begins to form. They would not sit idle. They would probe, they would analyze, and they would try to break the code of the minefield. But they were about to discover that the trap was far more complex than they could have imagined. The water was waiting. The silence of Haiphong harbor was deceptive. While the surface of the water remained glass calm, the radio frequencies between the port authority and the Soviet embassy were screaming with panic. The grace period had expired. The trap was now live. But the North Vietnamese were not a force that accepted passivity. They had defeated the French colonial empire. They were holding their own against the American war machine. They believed that any mechanical device made by man could be unmade by man. They began the counterattack against the water itself. Local commanders ordered the deployment of their mine-sweeping assets. In the classic understanding of naval warfare, mine-sweeping was a dangerous but straightforward calculus. You dragged heavy cables with mechanical cutters to sever the mooring lines of floating mines, or you used ships with powerful magnetic coils to detonate them prematurely. But as the North Vietnamese sweepers ventured out into the channel, they encountered a terrifying problem. There was nothing to cut. The American pilots had not dropped moored mines that bobbed on the surface. These were bottom mines. They sank deep into the silt, burying themselves in the muck of the riverbed. They were invisible to the naked eye and unreachable by mechanical cutters. The channel looked empty because the danger was sleeping in the mud. The Soviet advisors, watching through high-powered optics, realized the tactical nightmare unfolding. To clear these, you couldn't just cut a wire. You had to trick the mine into believing a ship was passing over it. They tried the madman tactic. Small, high-speed wooden boats were sent dashing across the suspected minefields. The logic was simple. The boats would trigger the mine, but their speed would carry them past the blast radius before the water column erupted. It was a game of Russian roulette, played with high explosives. The boats raced across the water. The engines roared. The wakes churned the harbor. And again, nothing. The mines refused to detonate. This lack of reaction was more demoralizing than an explosion. If the mines had blown up, at least the Soviets would know they were working. They would know where they were. But the silence suggested a level of technological sophistication that was alien to this theater of war. These weapons were discriminating. They were listening. Inside the cylindrical casing of these Mark 52 and Mark 50 mines lay a complex series of logic circuits, primitive computers. They weren't just looking for metal. They were looking for a specific signature. The magnetic field of a 1,000-ton steel hull is distinct. It warps the Earth's magnetic field in a very specific shape. The acoustic thrum of a heavy freighter's screw turning at 60 revolutions per minute is a unique fingerprint. The mines were programmed to ignore the frantic buzzing of small wooden boats. They were hunting whales, not minnows. The frustration in the Soviet High Command turned to anger. They had 26 ships trapped in Haiphong and 10 more waiting outside the blast zone, unable to enter. The Grisha Akopyan and her sister ships were effectively floating prisons. The captains were ordered to shut down their engines to avoid creating any acoustic signature that might drift through the water and wake the sleeping weapons. The paralysis began to bleed outward from the harbor, infecting the entire war effort. Hundreds of miles to the south, the impact of the invisible siege was instantaneous. The North Vietnamese Easter Offensive was a mechanized juggernaut. It relied on a river of fuel and mountains of artillery shells. An offensive of that scale consumes supplies at a rate that is hard to comprehend, hundreds of tons per day. On the front lines near An Loc, North Vietnamese tank commanders in their T-54 tanks began to check their ammunition racks with growing concern. The constant barrage of heavy artillery that had pinned down the South Vietnamese defenders began to slacken. The fire missions were rationed. "Where are the shells?" the commanders demanded. The answer was sitting in the dark hold of a freighter, stuck in the mud in Haiphong, guarded by a device that cost less than a used car. The Soviets tried to adapt. If they couldn't bring the ships to the docks, they would bring the docks to the ships. They attempted to unload the freighters onto smaller barges, lighters anchored safely offshore, and then ferry the supplies in. But the Americans had anticipated this. The A6 intruders returned. They didn't just mine the deep water channels, they had seeded the shallow littorals with the Destructor series mines, modified general-purpose bombs fitted with magnetic influence fuses. These were sensitive enough to detect the engine blocks of the barges or the metal in the cargo itself. The noose was absolute. Back in Haiphong, the paranoia deepened. The Soviet crews began to notice something else, a detail that whispered of a psychological cruelty built into the American design. Occasionally, a mine would detonate, but not when a ship passed. A column of water would simply erupt in the empty channel, hours after any movement. Was it a malfunction? Or was it a feature? The uncertainty broke the nerve of the harbor pilots. If the mines were on random timers, or if they had ship counters, mechanisms that let 5 ships pass safely only to blow up the 6th, then there was no such thing as a safe route. A channel that was swept in the morning could be lethal by noon. The Soviet Union, a superpower with nuclear submarines and orbital satellites, found itself defeated by probability. They could not calculate the odds. And because they could not calculate the odds, they could not move. The logistics of the North Vietnam Army began to asphyxiate. The pipelines were dry. The rail lines from China were being hammered by B-52 bombers, and now the sea route, the most efficient artery, was clotted. In the Pentagon, the admirals watched the tracking data. They saw the radar blips of the Soviet merchant fleet doing something they had never done before, turning around. The ships that were en route to Vietnam from the Black Sea and Vladivostok diverted. They headed for calm ports in China, or returned home. They weren't going to risk their hulls. But for the men trapped inside the harbor, the mystery was about to shift from, how do we sweep them, to, what are they planning next? Because as the weeks dragged on, and the monsoon rains began to lash the decks of the stranded ships, the Soviet intelligence officers realized that the Americans hadn't just laid a minefield, they had laid a clock. The silence of the mines was not just about target discrimination, it was about something far more sinister, a feature that would eventually lead to one of the most bizarre conclusions of the entire Vietnam War. The Americans weren't just playing with explosives, they were playing with time itself, and the Soviets were running out of it. By late May, the air inside the Haiphong harbor was thick with the stench of stagnation. The tropical heat turned the steel hulls of the trapped Soviet freighters into ovens. On the docks, the crates of food supplies intended for the front lines began to rot, the smell mingling with the acrid fumes of unburnt diesel. The paralysis had shifted from a tactical problem to a political crisis. Moscow was humiliated. The Kremlin dispatched their top mine warfare specialists to North Vietnam, flying them into Hanoi on secret flights aboard Ilyushin Il-18 aircraft. These were men who had written the textbooks on naval defense. They arrived with blueprints, detection gear, and an air of professional confidence. They believed that every American weapon had a flaw, a frequency, or a blind spot that could be exploited. They set up a command post overlooking the muddy expanse of the harbor. They watched the water, ready to solve the puzzle. But as they began to analyze the pattern of the few explosions that had occurred, a chilling realization took hold. The randomness that had terrified the ship captains was not a malfunction, it was a program. The Soviet engineers observed a sweeper vessel dragging a powerful magnetic sled designed to mimic the signature of a 10,000-ton freighter. The sled passed over a sector of the channel. The water remained flat. The sled passed a second time. Silence. A third time. Nothing. The crew on the sweeper signaled, all clear. They marked the lane with buoys. It was safe. Then, a test barge was towed into the safe lane. The water erupted. A column of spray shot 300 feet into the air, snapping the barge in half like a dry twig. The Soviet experts turned pale. They realized they were up against a feature they had feared, but hoped the Americans wouldn't use. The ship counter. Inside the logic brain of the Mark 52 mines, there was a stepping switch. The mine could be set to sleep through a specific number of events. It could let the first ship pass. It could let the minesweeper pass. It could let the lead escort pass. It would wait, ticking down its internal abacus, until the high-value target, the fuel tanker or the ammunition ship, moved directly overhead. Then, and only then, would it fire. This discovery destroyed the very concept of sweeping. How could you declare a channel safe? If you swept it 5 times and nothing blew up, did that mean the mine was gone? Or did it mean the mine was set to explode on the 6th pass? The mathematics of survival became impossible. To ensure a channel was truly clear, you would have to run a sweeper over it dozens of times. But they didn't have the time. The war in the south was collapsing. The North Vietnamese army was rationing shells to a few rounds per day. They needed the supplies now. Desperation drove them to improvise. The North Vietnamese, showing their characteristic ingenuity, tried to brute force the problem. If they couldn't trick the mines with technology, they would overwhelm them with junk. They lashed together rafts of bamboo and scrap metal. They threw engines from wrecked trucks onto logs to create magnetic noise. They sent these suicide drones drifting down the current, hoping to trigger the counters and clear a path. It was a chaotic, noisy spectacle. And occasionally it worked. A geyser of mud would roar up from the riverbed, claiming a pile of scrap metal. A cheer would go up from the docks. But the Americans were watching. High above, the electronic warfare officers in the back seats of the US Navy jets were monitoring the harbour. They saw the explosions. They saw the attempts to clear the lanes. And this is where the Americans played their cruelest card. They didn't just watch, they refreshed the game. Just as the Soviet engineers felt they were making progress clearing a narrow, tentative lane for a single ship to escape, the roar of jet engines would return. A flight of A-7 Corsair aircraft would scream over the harbour, not attacking but receding. New parachutes blossomed. Fresh mines splashed into the very lanes that had just been painfully, slowly cleared. It was a psychological bludgeoning. The work of weeks was undone in seconds. The Soviet captains, watching from their bridges, threw their hats on the deck in rage. It was like trying to shovel snow in a blizzard. But the true twist, the thing that kept the Soviet intelligence officers awake at night, was an anomaly they couldn't explain. They had reports of mines detonating without any ships nearby, not immediately after a drop, but days later, at odd hours. In the middle of the night, why would a mine explode with no target? Was it a battery failure? A short circuit? The Soviet analysts began to suspect a terrifying possibility. The Americans hadn't just mined the harbour to destroy ships, they had mined it to destroy the mind of the enemy commander. If a mine could blow up randomly, then the harbour wasn't just a minefield. It was a time bomb. The uncertainty created a level of stress that broke the discipline of the crews. Sailors on the trapped ships refused to sleep below the waterline. Rumors spread that the Americans had dropped nuclear mines or biological weapons. The Soviet Union, the great superpower, was reduced to a helpless spectator. They had the tanks, they had the missiles, and they had the ships. But they were defeated by a 12-foot cylinder buried in the mud that was doing absolutely nothing but thinking. And then, as June approached, the mystery deepened. The American president made another announcement. He spoke with a strange confidence about the future of the minefield. He didn't speak of it as a permanent blockade. He spoke of it as having a lifespan. The Soviet experts looked at the data. They looked at the inexplicable self-detonations. And they began to realize that the shock was not that the mines were invincible. The shock was that the mines were dying. But they were dying in a way that was calculated to inflict maximum terror. The end of the blockade was coming, but not through Soviet effort. It was coming because the Americans had programmed the war to end on their own schedule. The mechanism behind this, and the bizarre spectacle that would occur when the war finally ended, would reveal the ultimate mastery of the American technology. The trap had a timer, and it was ticking down to a display of power that no one in Haiphong was ready to witness. January 1973. The Paris Peace Accords were signed. The war for the Americans was officially over. But in Haiphong Harbour, the war was still alive. It was waiting in the mud. The Soviet captains on the Grisha Kopyan and the other trapped vessels had been prisoners of the harbour for nearly 9 months. Their hulls were fouled with barnacles. Their morale was shattered. They had watched the seasons change while sitting at anchor, unable to move a single propeller. The blockade had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had strangled the North Vietnamese offensive. Without the flow of Soviet heavy armour and fuel, the communist juggernaut in the south had stalled, sputtered, and finally halted. The Easter offensive had failed, not just because of the soldiers on the ground, but because the gas tanks were empty. The mines had forced the leadership in Hanoi to the negotiating table. But now, a new and surreal chapter began. As part of the peace treaty, the United States agreed to a condition that seemed almost humiliating on paper. The US Navy would clear its own mines. For the Soviet observers, this was the moment of truth. They had spent months trying to sweep these weapons and failed. Now, they would watch the masters at work. They expected a massive fleet of American destroyers and minesweepers to arrive. Instead, they saw helicopters. On February 27, 1973, the sky over Haiphong filled with the heavy, thumping rhythm of engines. But these weren't attack jets. They were massive CH-53 Sea Stallions heavy-lift giants painted in US Navy grey. This was Operation End Sweep. The Soviets watched through their binoculars, mesmerized. The helicopters didn't touch the water. They hovered low, dragging strange hydrofoil sleds behind them on long cables. This was the Mark 105 hydrofoil sled. It looked like a piece of space-age debris skimming the surface. But inside, it was a portable power plant. A gas turbine engine on the sled generated a massive magnetic field, projecting the signature of a 20,000-ton ship into the water, while the helicopter remained safely in the air, immune to the blast. It was a display of technological dominance that bordered on arrogance. The Americans were sweeping the most dangerous harbor in the world without getting their feet wet. But then, the true shock occurred, the reveal that answered the mystery of the random explosions and the dying mines. As the American operation began, the North Vietnamese liaisons handed over their charts of where they believed the mines were. The Americans took the charts, but they also checked their own watches. Suddenly, large sections of the minefield began to self-destruct. Without a ship passing, without a sweeper sled, and without a command signal, the water in the harbor began to erupt in a chain reaction of white plumes. It wasn't a malfunction. It was the sterilization feature. The engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory had built a final failsafe into the Mark 52 and Mark 50 mines. They knew that a mine that stays live forever is a liability. So, they had installed a simple chemical clock. It was a component designed to corrode at a precise rate. When the corrosion cut a specific wire or drained a specific capacitor, the mine would either inert itself, turning into a harmless metal drum, or in many cases, detonate to prove it was gone. The Americans had literally programmed the end of the war into the circuitry of the weapon. The Soviet advisors stood on the decks of their trapped ships, watching the harbor clean itself. The realization was bitter. The Americans hadn't just controlled the space, they had controlled the time. The random explosions they had feared for months were just the mines checking their internal calendars. For the next few months, the American helicopters methodically mowed the grass of the harbor. There were close calls. On a few occasions, a mine detonated so close to the sled that the shockwave punched the tail rotor of the towing helicopter, forcing emergency landings. But the system worked. By June 1973, the channel was declared safe. The moment of release was anticlimactic but deeply symbolic. The Grisha Akopian, its engines coughing black smoke after months of inactivity, finally weighed anchor. The Soviet merchant fleet, the pride of the communist supply chain, formed a line and began to steam out of the harbor. But as they passed the breakwater, they had to navigate strictly between the buoys laid by the US Navy. They were leaving not because they had broken the siege, but because the jailer had opened the gate. The Soviet captains looked up. Hovering above them was a lone CH-53 Sea Stallion watching them leave. The supply ships returned to Vladivostok, not as heroes who had run the blockade, but as witnesses to a new era of warfare. They brought back the story of a siege where the enemy never fired a shot from a ship, yet held an entire Navy hostage for 300 days. The mining of Haiphong harbor proved that in the Cold War, the most devastating weapon wasn't always the one that made the biggest bang. It was the one that made the enemy afraid to move. The Americans had turned the ocean itself into a weapon, and the Soviets, for all their might, had found themselves helpless against the silence of the water. This was the genius of Operation Pocket Money. It won the war of logistics by doing nothing but waiting.